Hi guys, and welcome to this seminar of the PhenoLab. Today it's my great joy to host Professor Bill Fullford. Professor Fullford is a fellow at St. Catherine College and member of the philosophy faculty at the University of Oxford. Emeritus Professor of Philosophy and Mental Health at the University of Warwick, he is the founder director of the Collaborative Centre for Values-Based Practice at St. Catherine College at the University of Oxford. His previous posts include honorary consultant psychiatrist at the University of Oxford and a special advisor for values-based practice in the UK Department of Health in London. He is founder, editor, and chair of the advisory board of Philosophy, Psychiatry, and Psychology. He has published widely on philosophical and ethical aspects of mental health, including moral theory and medical practice, the Oxford textbook of philosophy and psychiatry, and the monumental Oxford Handbook of Philosophy and Psychiatry, as well as the Essential Values-Based Practice. He edits the Cambridge University Breast Book series on values-based medicine. And he was awarded in 2022 the Margrethe Egner Foundation Award, and last year Bill was awarded the Aristotle Gold Medal. I'm very happy that you are here with us, Bill, at the PhenoLab.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Francesca. It's very much appreciated. Now, I immediately have a new technical problem. How do I advance the screen to the next slide? Because when I press the arrows, they don't...
You can. Yes, exactly. You can both press the arrows or use the keyboard. What you prefer?
I think pressing an arrow, but I can't. Oh, there we go. I've now just clicked on the screen. So I'm going to be talking about values and values-based practice in person-centered psychiatric care, and we're going to use a case study of delusion. I just would like to check, Francesca, how many of your group are working in psychiatry or psychology, and how many are in philosophy?
I can see some people that are in the field of psychology, some of them in the field of psychiatry. There's also some philosopher, some neuroscientists. So it's a bunch of people with a very different background.
Right. Well, that's helpful. As you said in your introduction, I have a background partly in psychiatry and medicine and partly in philosophy. And I'm going to be bringing those two sides of my background together in this presentation. So I hope there will be something for everybody. And although it's a case study of delusion, as you'll see when we get to the case study, it's one that you can relate to whether you are a practitioner or a philosopher. So this is the plan of the presentation. I'm going to be saying a little bit about the background to this work in what's called ordinary language philosophy. And that will lead us straight into the case study of a man that I'm calling Simon. And you'll see that this is a case study that's looking at the links between delusion and spiritual experience. That will lead us into thinking about values-based practice and person-centered care. And then I'm going to finish with some conclusions that I've called the next generation. You'll see why when we get to the end. Although we've got questions at the end, if you want to ask a question as we go along, then please do. But you'll have to probably do that through Francesca. And Francesca, I don't mind being interrupted if somebody wants to raise an issue.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you.
So here, let's start then with ordinary language philosophy. Now, I know we've got some philosophers in the room, as they say, but not everybody knows what ordinary language philosophy is. So I'm going to say a little bit about the background to this work, which, as I say, is in this branch of philosophy called ordinary language philosophy. I'm going to start, though, by taking a step back, and I'd like you just to consider the implications of this image, which is taken from a journal called The New Scientist. And it's about 20 years old now, this image, but to me, it brilliantly captures what's so exciting about contemporary neuroscience. And I'm glad that we have some neuroscientists in the group, because I want to start by emphasizing that although I'm going to be talking about philosophy and values and person-centered care, nothing that I am going to say should be considered in any way anti-science. There has been a fashion for using philosophy and ethics in some way to diminish the importance of science, but I start with this image and I'll end with it, because it's very important that we understand that everything I'm talking about is to be considered within that framework of contemporary medical science, and it's important for us in medicine in general and in psychiatry in particular. So here's some of the background in philosophy and psychiatry. Francesca, you'd kindly mentioned my involvement in this work, but it's important that we understand how widespread the movement is now. And I know that many in your group will be aware of some of these developments. There are groups all around the world now. You can see there are 40 new academic and practice-based groups around the world. There are special sections in the World Psychiatric Association and the European Association of Psychiatrists. There's an international network for philosophy and psychiatry, which was launched in Cape Town in 2002. And its next conference, which I'll come back to in a moment, is in Vienna this year. And that's the latest in a long series of conferences that have been organized in every continent of the world. We've also got new professorial chairs, academic chairs in the UK, Netherlands, Italy, and now outside Europe in South Africa, in the what's a chap called Verdi van Staden, who is the Nelson Mandela Professor of Philosophy and Psychiatry at Pretoria. There are many new training programs and research programs. Francesca, I know you're involved with one of them. We have a journal, Philosophy, Psychiatry and Psychology, which the referees, when we set it up, said we'd be lucky if it lasted 6 months. It's now in its 30th year and doing very well under the leadership of my colleague in the States, John Sadler. Oxford Philosophy has been very active in this field. We have had a DPhil program. We have postdoc fellows in philosophy and psychiatry. Edward Harcourt, who's an ex-chair of the faculty, runs a series of summer schools. We have a book series, which, a bit like the journal, was considered by the referees to be a non-starter and now has over 50 volumes. And Francesca, the handbook and the textbook that you mentioned are both in that series. And the latest development in Oxford is an endowed tutorial fellowship, which has £2 million of endowment behind it. And that is at St. Catherine's College. And it's a fellowship for a young man called Philip Corrales, who's a German philosopher and psychologist and mathematician. And he's got what's called the Fullford Clarendon Chair in Philosophy and Philosophy of Mind. I think the full title is Philosophy of Mind with Special Relevance to Psychiatry and Neuroscience. And Philip is an expert in a field that you might not immediately associate with philosophy and psychiatry, semantic logic, and he builds mathematical models of reasoning. Very exciting and interesting work. So there's a lot going on. I'll come back to the philosophy and practice in a moment. But just before we move on, here's the advert for the Vienna conference, which you can see is next month in Vienna, 23rd to 25th of May. It's not too late to register if you're interested in crisis and mental health, philosophical and social aesthetic perspectives. The person leading this conference is Michael Musilek, who is a great expert in aesthetics and mental health, which is one of the new and growing aspects of the philosophy and psychiatry. So coming back to philosophy into practice, it's very important that the field is not, as it were, merely academic, but also very practical. And there are many aspects of the field that are important. Francesca, your work in phenomenology and people like Giovanni Stangolini and Guillermo Mezas, who we'll come back to, is of course important in psychopathology and with its relevance to neuroscience. We've had work on legal responsibility and some very interesting work on responsibility without blame. And I'm going to be talking about this last area here, values-based practice. Coming back to ordinary language philosophy, This philosopher, I would suspect that the philosophers here wouldn't necessarily have heard of J.L. Austin, John Langshaw Austin, but Austin was the White's professor of moral philosophy in Oxford in the 1950s and early 60s. And he developed an approach to philosophy that he called ordinary language philosophy, because it explores the meanings of our core concepts, not in an abstract way, but through the way they appear in language. So it's using language use as a guide to meaning. And what Austin, above all, pointed out was that what this gives us is not a final answer about the meaning of our core concepts like values, but a more complete view of their meanings. And he's not only did he say we get a more complete view, but he advocated the use of case studies. So this brings us to our second section of the presentation, which is the case study. And as you'll see, I've called this the story of Simon, and it's about delusion and spiritual experience. Now, Francesca, with your permission, everybody, I'm going to just tell you about Simon. Sometimes we do this interactively, but I think it's with the challenge of doing it by PowerPoint over Zoom, I'm going to present Simon's story. But what I'd like you to do is to think about Simon. And if you're a philosopher, imagine that Simon is somebody that you care about, your father or brother, somebody who's close that you're close to, or maybe your friend. And if you're a practitioner, if you're a psychiatrist or psychologist, imagine that Simon is your patient. So remember, this is ordinary language philosophy. I want you to try and relate to Simon as a real person, not as a philosophical exercise. Francesca, I can't actually see the group at the moment, but is there anybody who's looking as though they don't know what I'm talking about? Or shall I carry on?
No, you should. I think you can carry on, Bill.
Very
Nobody
good.
is raising their hand, so
Right,
I think so
okay.
far so clear.
Well, don't forget, everybody, if I'm saying something that doesn't make sense to you, raise your hand and then we can take a question. So the story of Simon. Simon was about in his 40s, and he was a senior Black American professional from a middle-class Baptist family working in the United States of America in the southern states. Now, he had no history of psychiatric disorder, but he had occasional, what he described as psychic experiences. And like I gather many people in the States, he'd consulted a professional seer, so somebody who could tell you about these experiences. And he used to consult this man as a wise man that he consulted when he had major life events and decisions. But apart from that, his background was just as a lawyer and completely unremarkable from a psychiatric point of view. Now, the story starts about 4 years before he was first seen. He was seen by us in Oxford originally. And the story was that his career, which had been very successful up to that point, was suddenly threatened by a malpractice action from his colleagues. Now, it wasn't clear what this was about, this malpractice action, but basically they were saying that he'd done something seriously wrong as a lawyer. And so it was a very difficult situation for Simon, who was Black, and many of his colleagues were white, and he was working in the southern states of America, so it was a dangerous and threatening situation. And how did he respond? Well, what he did was, remember, he has no background in psychopathology, no background in religion, other than that he comes from a Baptist family. But he went home, and if you can imagine, he went home and went into his front room where there was a table, and there was a big box with the old family Bible in it. And he got this Bible out and opened it and put it on the table, and then put a couple of candles, one either side of the Bible. And then he knelt down in front of the Bible and prayed all night. Now, this is a man who'd really dropped out of religion, but faced with this threatening situation, he suddenly dropped back into very extreme religiosity, and he prayed all night. Now, when he got up in the morning from his prayers, he found that the wax from the candles, I don't know if you can see my hands, but I'm just holding them up to show how the wax had run down from the candles onto the Bible and marked certain passages, which Simon called a seal or sun, these wax marks. And this is how he described his experience. This is a quote from Simon. "I got up and I saw the seal that was in my father's Bible, and I called my friend and I said, 'You know, something remarkable is going on over here. I think the beauty of it was the specificity by which the sun burned through. It was, in my mind, a clever play on words.'" Now, these marked words and letters had no explicit meaning, and they meant nothing to Simon's friends or family. But Simon himself interpreted them as a direct communication from God, which signified that he had a special purpose or mission. And after this first event, he continued to receive what he called revelations, largely conveyed through the images that were left in the melted candle wax. It was some years ago. It was in the days of Polaroid photography, and he used to take Polaroid images and then keep these images and carry them around with him. And what he said they meant to him, they meant nothing to anybody else, but he said that they were basically biblical symbols, particularly from the book of Revelations, the book, the 24 elders, the Ark of the Covenant, and so forth. They signified, and this is Simon again, that I am the living son of David, and I'm also a relative of Ishmael and of Joseph. I'm the captain of the guard of Israel. He found that this role carried awesome responsibilities. Sometimes, this is Simon again, sometimes I'm saying, "Oh my God, why did you choose me?" And there's no answer to that. His special status had the effect of increasing my own inward sense, wisdom, understanding, and endurance. And that will allow me to do whatever is required in terms of bringing whatever message it is that God wants me to bring. Now, Simon was totally convinced by these experiences, although they meant nothing, as I say, to his friends and family, including people in the Baptist church. And he described them like this. He said, "The truths that are up in that room where he had his first experience are the truths that have been spoken of for 4,000 years. And when people were skeptical, he said, I don't get upset because I know within myself what I know." Now, Francesca, does anybody have any comments on sorry, I've gone a bit too far back. Does anybody have any comments on the story so far?
No, as far as I can see, no.
Good. So what I want to do is, remember, we're talking about use of concepts through language use, and particularly as evident in case studies. What I'm going to do is, we might all have different views about what's happening to Simon, but I'm going to look at how psychiatry would understand Simon's story through, first of all, the International Classification of Diseases, which is the World Health Organization's classification, and then through the American Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the manual of the American Psychiatric Association. And as we'll see, we'll get the messages from that. So here's the first approach, which is through the World Health Organization's classification. Now, in that classification, we understand that Simon has what's called a delusional perception. Now, this is a delusion which is based on sensory experiences. Remember, his delusions grew out of these wax seals or suns that the wax candle melting onto the Bible had formed, and involves suddenly becoming convinced that a particular set of events has a special meaning. Now, most people would say that's Simon exactly. So Simon not only has delusions, he has what's called a delusional perception. And in the World Health Organization classification, which is the cover of which you can see here, if you have a delusional perception or one of a number of other specific symptoms, then that means that you have got a psychotic illness, probably schizophrenia. Now, you may not agree with this, and as we'll see, there are good reasons for not necessarily agreeing with it, but that's where you're taken with the classification that Europe and many other parts of the world use based on the World Health Organization classification. So what happened to Simon? Those of you who are working clinically will be expecting him, if he does indeed have a psychotic illness like schizophrenia, he would deteriorate. But in fact, what happened to Simon was that he was not only empowered by these experiences, but he was guided by them. Now, to this day, we don't know how this worked, but he was a lawyer. Somehow, he took information from those images that he was photographing with his Polaroid camera, and they guided him in his legal case, which he took on personally and decided to defend himself. He said, you know, he was going to defend his own case as a lawyer. And the wax messages, the messages in the wax seals guided him, even down to which law book to look at and what cases to look at. Sorry, somebody wanted to ask a question.
No, just someone perhaps left the microphone open.
Oh, okay.
So
right.
There's some background noise.
I'll carry on then. So Simon was guided by these wax seals. Remember, they meant nothing to anybody else. And he actually won his court case, which was shown to be, remember, it was in the southern states of America, so it was a remarkable achievement. It was shown to be a racially motivated attack on Simon as a black lawyer. And he won his case. And then his career as a lawyer went from strength to strength. And he ended up not only a very successful lawyer, but making a great deal of money. And he set up a foundation, a research foundation, that was to study not psychotic experience, but religious experience. So I'll pause there. Now remember, we've got the World Health Organization, a highly respected classification system, suggests that he should be seriously ill. But for most people, this is not the story of somebody who's seriously ill. It's somebody who's empowered and functioning at the top of their game. Does anybody want to disagree with that? We'll have some questions and answers later, but let me show you where the story then goes, because if we move from the World Health Organization classification to the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and the DSM-5 is the latest version of this manual, we actually get a very different understanding of Simon. Because the American system, and remember, I'm not commenting for or against the different systems, I'm just saying this is where the words take us, the language takes us. The American system has an additional criterion for psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, which they call criterion B. And to have a diagnosis of schizophrenia in the American system, you have to have delusional perception or one of those symptoms, specific symptoms that are in the World Health Organization classification. But in addition, and that's criterion A, in addition, you have to satisfy criterion B. Now, if you think about Simon and criterion B, let me just read this to you and see if you agree that he doesn't satisfy criterion B. So to satisfy criterion B, for a significant portion of the time since the onset of the disturbance, level of functioning in one or more major areas such as work, interpersonal relations, or self-care is markedly below the level achieved prior to the onset. Or when the onset is in childhood or adolescence, there is failure to achieve expected levels of interpersonal, academic, or occupational functioning. Now, we don't know about Simon's interpersonal relations or self-care, but as far as his work is concerned, he certainly wasn't functioning below the level. He was functioning above the level he did previously achieved. So he doesn't satisfy criterion B. Where does that take us? Well, in Simon's story, the ICD suggests he has a psychotic illness. The DSM says he has a spiritual experience, or he could have a spiritual experience, which is how he understood the experience himself. So the question is, why? Now, you can imagine when I present this story in the United States, they are very pleased to say, well, the DSM seems to make more sense than the World Health Organization's ICD. And why is that? They say it's because the DSM is based on scientific evidence. Now, this has been true from the start, that there's been a particular attention to the evidence, but it was brought very much to the fore in the 4th edition of DSM by Alan Francis, who was the chair of the DSM task force for the DSM-4. And this is Alan Francis' introduction to DSM-4, where he talks about it will be based on an extensive empirical foundation, taking the breadth of available evidence. There will be formal evidence-based processes for the work groups to follow, drawing on the widest pool of information. It's all the language of evidence-based medicine. So the question is, are our American colleagues right? Is criterion B just a matter of the evidence? So let's look at it again. Now I'm going to read this again, and as you think about it, think, is this, when we're saying that Simon clearly doesn't satisfy criterion B, what sort of thing are we saying? For a significant portion of the time since the onset of the disturbance, level of functioning in one or more major areas, such as work, interpersonal relations, or self-care, is markedly below the level achieved prior to the onset, or when the onset is in childhood or adolescence, there is failure to achieve expected levels of interpersonal, academic, or occupational functioning. Francesca, if we were doing this interactively, I'd be asking people to say, do they think that when they're interpreting this criterion, it's purely a matter of the evidence?
Well, if I may say something, to me,
Yes,
it seems
please.
that
Yes.
it seems to me that this criteria is not satisfied at all. And professionally speaking, Simon's life was very above the ordinary level. So the evidence-based is not on the table.
Well,
rather,
the evidence is there, Francesca, but you're interpreting it in a particular, putting a particular interpretation on it. So what is the interpretation you're putting on it? When you say he's functioning above, not below the level, what are you talking about?
Well, I start to be focused on his achievements and on his professional life, based upon what you record about this story. And if he was so successful to the extent that was also able to collect money and open foundation to study religious experience, it seems to me that this sentence is marked below the level achieved prior to the onset.
But it's actually above the level, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
And you use the term success, and you see it says that's success as opposed to failure to achieve when the onset is in childhood or adolescence. So what are we talking about here? Success, failure, good, bad? What is it that we're talking about? Broadly. Isn't it values?
Yes, they are.
Yes, so here's I've marked the values here, you see. Values in criterion B. So the evidence is there, but we're making a value judgment based on the evidence. And we're saying, based on the evidence, far from functioning below the level achieved prior to the onset, Simon was functioning above the level, at least in his work. And if he'd been a child or adolescent, far from there being failure to achieve expected levels, he was showing a remarkable success in achieving expected levels, above the expected levels. So, Francesca, I'm agreeing with you that it's not just the evidence, but I would want to emphasize we need to look at the evidence, but then we make a value judgment based on the evidence. And that's going to lead us into the need for values-based practice in just a moment. So what we've got now to summarize is that criterion B is a matter of the evidence, but it's also a matter of values. Francesca, have I persuaded you of that?
Yes. And as a philosopher, I have all my own questioning and pondering about what is the value and how value is related to criterion that, are rooted in evidence-based.
I don't resist that. I just want to get us from evidence to evidence plus values at this stage. And remember, it's the ordinary language use of these terms that we're focusing on at the moment. So with that caveat, and then when at the end, we can come back to questioning about what are values from a philosopher's point of view, which I won't pretend to be able to deal with, Francesca, but let's see where we get to with it. So it is a matter of evidence, but it's also a matter of the values. And it's that twin approach that is going to be behind the rest of what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. It's not that, remember I started with that image of the brain imaging composite picture and the remarkable science that sits behind that. Everything about this is how we use the science. It's not against science. It's about using the science in a better way in partnership with our clients and patients. So Simon's story, to sum up, we can say in the International Classification of Diseases, the World Health Organization classification, we had to say that he has a psychotic illness. In the DSM, we can at least make room for him having a spiritual experience, and that was indeed how he understood his experience. And the difference is not the evidence, it's the values. It's what says on the evidence he was functioning above rather than below the level previously achieved. I suspect many in the group will have questions for this, but if you want to ask a question now, that's fine. Put your hand up or signal it to Francesca. Otherwise, we'll take the questions at the end. Okay?
Yes.
Very good.
I don't see hands now at the moment.
Very good. So just to tidy that up, I mentioned John Sadler earlier, who's been the editor of the journal for the last 10 years. And John, a few years ago, wrote a wonderful book called Values and Psychiatric Diagnosis. John is a very good philosopher as well as psychiatrist. And he did an ordinary language analysis of the whole of the DSM. And basically, he found that values weren't just in criterion B, but they're all over the DSM classification. I did a similar thing for the ICD, where the values are more implicit, but basically the values are all the way through. Just to bring you right up to date, I haven't even got a picture of this book yet. John has literally this year just brought out a book in the same series called Vice and Psychiatric Diagnosis. It's a much bigger book than the Values and Psychiatric Diagnosis, but you look out for it because it's a very interesting and very big book on this important topic. So how do we understand these values? Well, again, Francesca, I'm going to run rather quickly through the philosophy here, but there are three interpretations. The first is represented by this Thomas Szasz. Thomas Szasz was a famous critic of psychiatry. His claim was that mental illness is a myth, and he made that claim as a professor of psychiatry. He was actually at Syracuse University in the 60s and 70s and 80s. He sadly died a few years ago. Well, very few years ago. He lived well into his 90s. And you can see he looks a very sharp guy, and he made a very successful career out of his claim that mental illness is a myth. And the reason he said it's a myth is because he said values crop up in psychiatric diagnosis, but they don't in medical diagnosis. I don't agree with him, of course, but that's one position, to say that the values in psychiatric diagnosis show that it's, as Szasz thought, a social and legal concept and not a medical concept. Now, opposed to Szasz was a number of people, including this man, Bob Kendall, who was another very bright young psychiatrist in the 60s and 70s. And Bob Kendall became the youngest professor of psychiatry, in fact, the youngest professor at Edinburgh University. And he used his inaugural address as a professor to argue against Thomas Szasz's claims, basically saying that he agreed that there were values in psychiatric diagnosis, but he said, when we have enough neuroscience, the values will disappear. Francesca, you'll appreciate this is why I was emphasizing the importance of values plus science rather than values versus science. Bob Kendall was one of the people who argued that when we have enough science, we can get rid of the values. I think actually it's the reverse is the case, that the more science we have, the more values we need to take seriously. Back to J.L. Austin and ordinary language philosophy, and this gives us a third way of understanding the values in psychiatric diagnosis, which I won't run through in detail, but the bottom line is that ordinary language philosophy suggests that values in psychiatric diagnosis are there. It suggests that values are everywhere in all medical diagnosis, and you notice them when the values in question are highly diverse, and so they cause problems and become visible. And again, we can pick this up in the question and answer, but the essence of that idea is that psychiatry works in areas like emotion, desire, volition, motivation, sexuality, where human values are highly diverse. And because of that, we notice the values in a way that we don't in cardiology, where we're dealing with pain and death and things that most people agree are good or bad in their own right. I took this idea from ordinary language philosophy and applied it in my first book, rather boring looking book here, but it was basically an ordinary language philosophy book, applying ideas from ordinary language philosophy to the language of medicine. And that's what in turn has led to the development of this practical discipline of values-based practice. So you can think of values-based practice as the practical counterpart of that third way of understanding the values in psychiatric diagnosis. Values-based practice starts from, coming in out of the third part of my talk, values-based practice starts from the diversity of individual human values. If you think what ethics does, ethics, at least in many traditions, tries to say what are the right values and then insist on those values being followed. This starts from saying that in many areas of human behavior, and many particularly that psychiatry is concerned with, there's no one right value, but there's a great diversity of values that are in play. That's the starting point. And Francesca, you were saying, so what as a philosopher do we mean by values? Well, here's a practical way of thinking about values. Values in healthcare, at least, we can think of as anything that matters or is important to the individuals concerned. And that's the sense of the term values that I'll be using when we're talking about values-based practice. What matters or is important to the individuals concerned. So going back to evidence-based practice offers us a process that supports clinical decision-making where there are diverse evidences in play. So if you think of the processes of evidence-based medicine, any medics in the group will know all about this, that basically what you do is you take all the high-quality research, put it through a computer, and try and get to a consensus about what that research is telling us. And it's one way, it's a process based on meta-analyses and so forth that takes diverse evidence and tries to bring it into a coherent form that you can use in practice. Now, values-based practice does the same thing, but for values. So values-based practice, again, it offers a process. It doesn't give answers. It's a process that supports clinical decision-making where there are diverse values in play. So they're very, very similar. Evidence-based practice is about diverse evidence and a process for working with it. Values-based practice is about diverse values and offers a process for working with it. Again, I won't go through this rather complicated slide in detail, but it just illustrates the components of the process of values-based practice. And as you can see on the left-hand side of the arrow, there are 10 key process elements, and those together support balanced decision-making within frameworks of shared values. That's essentially what values-based practice seeks to do. And if you look again at the left-hand column, you can see that at the top of the list of the process elements of values-based practice are clinical skills, and it's developing the clinical skills and the training processes for developing those skills that we've been focusing on in the collaborating center. Although we have done some work on the model of service delivery, We've done a bit of work with the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine on the links between values and evidence. And I'm going to talk a bit more about partnership in decision-making in a moment. So here's the first training manual for values-based practice. This was developed by, as you can see, a woman called Kim Woodbridge and myself, and was launched in the Department of Health program that Francesca mentioned now about 20 years ago, in fact. And the book is, well, remains actually a very lively and valuable training manual. And I say this on behalf of Kim Woodbridge, who was a very skilled trainer. She was a nurse trainer, and we worked together on developing this first training manual for values-based practice. This is another program for the Department of Health where we looked at applying values-based practice specifically to psychiatric diagnosis. And you'll see that it talks about 3 keys to a shared approach in mental health assessment. And those 3 keys came out of a big consultation where we looked at what mattered or was important to different constituencies in mental health assessment. And those constituencies crucially included patients themselves and carers. So we had an approach that brought together patients and carers in partnership with clinicians, including psychiatrists, mental health nurses, social workers, and psychologists. So that's some of the work that led to the development of the collaborating centre. I have to hold my hand up here and admit that this picture looks as though we have a very big building, but that's actually St. Catherine's College, and the centre is a virtual centre. It's based on a website, which I put up there, valuesbasedpractice.org. And we do have as fellows of St. Catherine's, Ashok and I have the resources of the college, and the college has been wonderfully supportive in developing the centre, but it is in fact basically a virtual centre. And one of the areas we've been focusing on, which I think is very exciting for me as a psychiatrist by training, is surgical care. And the current director of the centre is Ashok Handa, who's Oxford's tutor for surgery. And as you can see from this picture, he's a practicing surgeon. He's basically a vascular surgeon, so he does big, very dangerous vascular surgical operations. And it's been very exciting to see the work on values-based practice moving from a focus in psychiatry. It's still going on in psychiatry, but now developing in other areas of medicine, including at the cutting edge, literally, of surgery. This is a training program that we developed for surgical care, and it's a training template which has been developed now by radiographers, ambulance drivers, a whole range of different people working in healthcare. So what's it all about? Well, it comes back to this relationship between evidence-based medicine and values-based medicine. And it's a person-centered clinical care that's based on partnership between these 2 approaches. So if you think of the evidence-based medicine as providing the information we need, values-based practice is about applying that information to each individual patient as a unique individual. We're not the first to say this, interestingly. This is a book on evidence-based medicine. You can see the first author is David Sackett. This book goes back about 25 years. David was one of the first people to develop the processes of evidence-based medicine, and he did that as director of Oxford's Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine. And evidence-based medicine nowadays is very much focusing on the research side of it. But what David said in his introduction to this book was that evidence-based practice is about integrating the research base with the clinician's experience and notice patients' values. And that's not me speaking, that's David Sackett 25 years ago at the early launch of evidence-based medicine. The best of evidence-based medicine continues that relationship. This is, again, looking at the words, this is the words from the preface to NICE guidance. NICE is the National Institutes for Health and Care Excellence in the UK, and NICE has responsibility for providing evidence-based guidelines to the whole of the National Health Service. And nobody ever reads the preface, but basically the preface tells you how the guidelines are to be used. And what the preface says is that professionals must use their judgment. That's very close to David's clinical experience. And whilst they take the guideline fully into account, they must do so alongside the individual needs, preferences, and values. And this is NICE's own words, individual needs, preferences, and values of their patients or service users. So the model is not a million miles from the best of evidence-based medicine. And it's a model that's been repeated in UK professional guidance. This is the GMC, which is our General Medical Council, that provides guidance to the medical profession in particular. And this is its guidance on consent. And you'll see that it was actually called Patients and Doctors Making Decisions Together. That guidance was incorporated into UK law through our Supreme Court in 2015 in a judgment called the Montgomery ruling, which basically took the GMC guidance and said, you doctors aren't doing this and you've jolly well got to. And so they said that nowadays in the UK, you don't have consent to treatment unless you've based this on a substantive process of shared decision-making that reflects both evidence-based medicine and values-based practice. So that's what the Collaborating Centre has been all around about. And if you want more on this, here's the website again, valuesbasedpractice.org. We have an extensive website that includes reading guides and downloadable materials. So there's lots of material there that you can look at if you're interested in this approach to healthcare decision-making. So I'm going to come now to some conclusions, just to talk about the next generation. Francesca, I'm aware that it's coming up to 4:45, but I need about 5 minutes for this last section. Is that okay?
Don't worry, Bill. Take your time. Take your
Right.
time. Don't worry.
Okay. So we started from J.L. Austin, and the third way, his third way, or what I've taken as the third way from ordinary language philosophy, which suggests that values become noticeable, they become explicit in psychiatric diagnosis, because psychiatry deals with aspects of human experience where our values are highly diverse. Again, this was picked up in an interesting way by a man called J.L.T. Burley, Jim Burley, who was an ex-president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And he wrote a preface to a book that I did a few years ago with an ethicist, Donna Dickinson. And you'll see it's a case book of psychiatric ethics. Now, Jim Burley had been very much involved with the international movement to oppose the abuse of psychiatry, and noticeably in the former Soviet Union. I think there's been recent concerns about some of the abuses of psychiatry in China, and there are certainly concerns about the abuse of psychiatry in this country, in the UK, in the context of racial mental health. So it's a very important and widespread issue about the abuse of psychiatry for non-medical purposes. And what Jim Burley said, based on his very wide experience of this, was that what we needed, if we were to ever deal with this, was what he called an international open society that could support best practice and reflected many different perspectives coming together. That international field has been opened up by a number of people, and I wanted here to pay my respects to Afzal Javed, who's the immediate past president of the World Psychiatric Association, and he's been extremely supportive of this work, including through a special section of the WPA called for Philosophy and Humanities. And Afzal, who's recently retired as president, that he's been very supportive to us in taking this work forward internationally. In philosophy, I mentioned Philip Corrales on the right there, working in semantic logic, and Anna Bergqvist, who's a Scandinavian philosopher. She's one of the few younger philosophers working in analytic philosophy of values. So we're very pleased that she's the theory lead for the Collaborating Centre. Phenomenology, of course, is very important. I mentioned Guillermo Mezas earlier and Giovanni Stancolini. Francesca, I know this is very much your field, so forgive me. This is two exemplars, one working with addictive disorders, the other with eating disorders, where phenomenology has been used to very good effect clinically. And other areas of philosophy altogether from outside Europe, so African and Caribbean philosophy. I mentioned Verdi van Staden, the Nelson Mandela professor, earlier. He's developed a whole model of values-based practice based on African philosophy called Bathopili. And I mentioned race equality and mental health, and Colin King on the left, who's a great campaigner, and he's based a lot of his work on the work of Frantz Fanon and W.E.B. Du Bois. So let me draw some brief conclusions. Ordinary language philosophy we started with, and we saw that it gives us a more complete view of the meanings of key concepts, notably through case studies. That led us into looking at the story of Simon, where we got a more complete, well, I've called it a values plus evidence view of diagnostic concepts that we need if we're to practice effectively in psychiatry. This isn't because psychiatry is somehow not a medical science, or, as Bob Kendall thought, just a too junior medical science. It's because psychiatry deals with areas of human experience and behavior where our values are highly diverse. This is Austin's third way of thinking about the values in psychiatric diagnosis. Values-based practice and person-centered care is that more complete view being worked out in practice. Values-based practice underpins the partnership between values and evidence as the basis of person-centered care. And I've suggested that to take this work forward, we need the next generation. And that's beginning to emerge in the context of an international open society prefigured by Jim Burley, now being taken forward by Afzal Jabed and others. I started with this image. I'm going to end with this image. It's not against science. This is all about how we use the science in practice. Indeed, we can think of the current moves as a rather exciting move from 20th century medical science, which was all about the evidence, to 21st century medical science, which is about bringing values together with the evidence. And here I quote the famous physicist Max Planck, who was one of the founders of quantum mechanics. You have heard of the Planck constant. And he describes in his intellectual autobiography being asked by a young, keen journalist, was it exciting to be in on the birth of a new science? And he replies rather grumpily, new sciences aren't born, old scientists die. So we have possibly a long way to go with the 21st century medical science combining evidence and values, but we have a wonderful new next generation of people coming together. I've introduced you to some of these earlier, around the next generation who I believe will boldly go, as in the famous Star Trek phrase. Thank you very much. Thank you, Francesca, and thank you everybody for your patience.